Welcome and thank you for coming along to my presentation today. I'm Ryan Gallagher. I'll be talking to you on spinal fractures and their conservative management and some of the issues that I've had to deal with in my working line, working in neurosurgery, dealing with patients in a rural background and in rural settings, and some of the problems and issues that I've encountered and strategies to help overcome that, and talking about a model of care that we've utilised in the area that I worked at, utilising basically telehealth as an option to help assist managing patients with a spinal fracture. So a little bit about, just a little disclaimer before I do launch into everything today. I'm presenting as myself. This is my personal opinion and my personal perspectives. Everything I'm presenting is publicly available, including the information on the model of care and the outcomes that are associated with that. It's all been published in peer-reviewed sources, and I'll provide links and references to any of the content that I'm presenting throughout the day. So if you want to check my facts or if you want further information, you'll be able to access all of that through the references that I listed as well. And I'll be around to take questions at the end as well if anybody's got any burning questions that come up out of it all. So about me, I am a physiotherapist by trade. I've been working in the New South Wales public health system since 2009. For the last nearly, I'd say, 9 years, I've been working full-time in neurosurgery and neuromedicine. Pretty much been working in that area the entire time I've been working, which is ironic because I hated neuro as a student, but once I started working in it as a field, it's something that just naturally clicked, and particularly the neurosurgical aspects I thoroughly enjoy, especially dealing with a lot of the spinal presentations and some of the issues that can go around managing those. I currently work in the John Hunter Hospital Neurosurgery Clinic as an advanced practice physiotherapist. And essentially, for people who don't know what that means, I work in a role. It's a triage position that's essentially assisting the neurosurgeons to sift and sort through the vast number of patients that are being referred to their clinic with spinal presentations that might not necessarily be amenable to surgical intervention and haven't yet gone through all the conservative management steps. It's predominantly your degenerative spinal conditions we're dealing with. It's not my role to deal with acute presentations, but it's more of the people that have been referred from their GP with longer standing issues, and making sure that everything that can be done for them from a conservative point of view is being considered first. In my first couple of years working, I did multiple rural hospital secondments. I've worked throughout rural New South Wales, and I'll be talking about some of my experiences in some of the towns that I've been working in. So I do have a bit of appreciation of some of the challenges that can be faced when you're a junior allied health professional and working on your own in a setting, and having all these things coming in that you just don't know what's going on. I've also completed my PhD in physiotherapy and neurosurgery, and I completed that last year. As a part of that PhD, I've got numerous journal publications, and I've presented both nationally and internationally on some of the findings of my PhD research. And I've also published in the area of spinal fractures, and particularly around managing rural health presentations and models of care around those. And if you're really interested and want to know more about me, there's a link there to my Orchid ID, which for the non-academics is basically a database with all of your an academic's individual presentations and publication history. So essentially what I'll be talking about today is some of the issues faced by rural clinicians, telehealth, and what it can do to help overcome rural health barriers, some of the background to a telehealth model of care that I was involved in deploying and utilising across northern New South Wales, and some of the outcomes that were a result of that model of care. Why I'm talking about it is working both rural, but also working in my role for the last 9 years in neurosurgery. I really started to notice there's a significant number of rural patients that were coming under my care and were travelling extensive distances just to be managed at a specialist hospital by a specialist clinician. And those patients and their family members were under considerable financial strain and time and financial just trying to receive timely care. Patients get transferred by helicopter or by plane to ensure timely care, but their family members have either got to drive themselves down here or find a mode of public transport which may not operate every day or may only operate once a week to where they're going, and can make things very challenging and very difficult just to be by their family member's side. And seeing all that really made me think there's got to be a better way to help manage these patients in their own facilities, or there's got to be a better way to go about it all. Some of the issues that you will about rural health in general. There's plenty of information out there in terms of the rural inequity and the rural metropolitan health divide. I'll touch on some of the information around that, and as I mentioned, there will be references throughout it all. But people in rural and remote areas have shorter lives, they have higher levels of disease and higher rates of injury, and there's less access to specialist healthcare, and you receive less healthcare in general if you live in a rural area. It's multiple factors that contribute to it, but it's widely understood that the level of disadvantage is predominantly due to income, education, employment opportunities, and your ability to access healthcare as well. Unfortunately, if the nearest hospital is a 100-kilometre drive away, you're not going to be going there unless something's really wrong. And that does have significant impacts. If you're delaying your healthcare because of the need to travel, then that obviously is going to have some implications for you. And as an aside, it's quite interesting, New South Wales Ambulance Service a few years ago had to run 2 different campaigns across New South Wales in regards to educating the public. They basically were finding that people that lived in metropolitan areas were calling ambulances for things that weren't emergencies, but people in rural areas wouldn't call ambulances at all and be driving themselves to hospital while having medical emergencies. And there was multiple cases of people driving themselves to hospital whilst having acute coronary events or having strokes because they didn't want to bother the only paramedic in the town because they didn't think they were that serious. And the ambulance service was having to literally run 2 different education campaigns depending on where in New South Wales was being broadcast. So just some stats around the differences in the rural health divide. In 2014, there were more GPs working in rural and remote areas than there were in major cities, which is interesting. But the overall rate of medical practitioners was significantly lower in rural and remote areas. And the number of GP services that were provided per person in very remote areas was half of that of major cities. So basically what that's saying is medical officers that work in rural areas are generalists by nature because there's just not the same exposure to specialty opportunities as what there are in metropolitan areas. The number of people that are accessing medical care in regional areas and rural areas is considerably less than what that is in your major metropolitan areas. People living in remote areas, as I said, need to travel a lot further. If you have ongoing chronic health complaints and you need to travel for it, you need to quite often move closer to where your healthcare is being provided. 57% of people, for example, in 2005 to 2010 that had end-stage kidney disease and were needing dialysis had to move closer to a dialysis centre because it was just not practical for them to be travelling the distances that they were. In 2013, 2014, emergency hospital admissions involving surgery were highest for people living in rural and remote areas, and they fell with decreasing remoteness as you got closer to the cities. So again, the further you had to travel, the less likely you are to engage in healthcare, and the longer you are likely to prolong seeking professional advice for whatever your health ailment is. And there's over 5 times as many deaths from car accidents or from motor vehicle accidents, and that includes farming accidents in rural remote areas than what there are in major cities. Again, because you're travelling so much, you're at higher risk of being involved in an incident. The death rates for diseases in remote Australia is significantly higher. I'll go into some of the stats around that in another slide, but the rate of land transport accidents is, as I said, is almost 5 to 6 times higher. Diabetes, you're 3 times more likely to die of diabetes if you don't live in a major city. There's twice the number of deaths by suicide in remote Australia. In terms of the disease burden from chronic disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so emphysema, smoking-related pulmonary disease, it's a 60% higher death rate in remote Australia than what it is in metropolitan areas. And again, that's lack of access to services and the lack of access to adequate management programs and pulmonary rehab programs and ongoing follow-up that just doesn't exist. Or lung cancer is 40% higher death rate in remote Australia, and you tend to die 3 years younger. Your life expectancy is 3 years less in a rural area than what it is if you live in a public area, in a major metropolitan region. And those stats are all from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare in their ongoing report they present in relation to rural health divides. And this is a breakdown. This is from a slightly different source, but it still paints the same picture. This is from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. It gives a breakdown by ICD-10 codes, which is a statistical platform to group together particular medical ailments. And you can see the death rate, the ratio between major cities and rural areas. And you can see that pretty much all of those, it's a ratio higher than 1, indicates that rural areas have a higher rate of people being affected by those. And looking at the bottom, transport accidents, as I said, it's 3 times higher rate. Hypertensive disease, so blood pressure related, is 1.9. Diabetes, listed here, interesting, is 1.6. And ischemic heart disease is nearly 1.5 times higher, based on the ABS statistics. It's not only patients that face issues related to being isolated and working in a rural and being in a rural environment. Clinicians also have the same barriers as well, and you will be faced with significant issues if you don't have the ability to be able to travel to receive professional development opportunities, and it can make it really hard to upskill yourself and be involved in dealing with all the various types of presentations that you've got to deal with. I personally worked in Gunnedah, which is a little town 4 hours drive west of Newcastle, and working there for a period of 4 months, I was the only physio in a radius of about 400 kilometres and having to deal with absolutely everything that came through the door. There were plenty of things from maternity and gynecology presentations, through to motor vehicle accidents, through to post-operative elective orthopaedic procedures that you get exposed to. And if I wasn't confident in dealing with any of those, there wasn't much choice than to try and to do the best that you can, and use the internet, use textbooks to look up what's going or what's recommended. Try to use your professional networks rather to help support you, but a lot of it in a metropolitan area, if you weren't sure, you'd be able to refer them on to a clinician with a better knowledge base, or at least have a chat with someone quite often in the same area as you, who might have more of an idea of what would be an appropriate treatment plan, but you just don't necessarily have that opportunity with when you work in a rural area. Another significant issue with rural clinicians is there's a very high turnover, particularly for nursing and allied health. It is a significant problem in terms of staff simply burn out. When you are the only clinician in your area and you're working all the time and you're having to deal with everything and you don't have a break, it can cause quite a lot of issues in terms of burnout, stress, and how staff cope. And a significant portion of the rural health facilities in the area that I've operated in all work on a secondment basis, and that was the majority of my experiences with working in rural health as well, that you're working in a secondment or a locum position. So you're coming in for a period of time and then you're leaving, and that still seems to be a very common model of care for managing health shortages in rural areas, as opposed to having people that are permanently living and working in their community. Another issue that you can face with rural generalists is you don't get enough presentations of a particular type of specialist in an area of it. Unlike working in a major metropolitan hospital where you may just work on the orthopaedic ward, or you may just work on the neurosurgery ward, or you may just work on the rehabilitation ward, quite often there's not enough presentations in the areas that you're dealing with that you have to know a bit of everything. And again, in the areas I worked in Cowra, also another small little facility, which is about another 5 hours in a different direction west from Sydney. In the space of a day, you could go from reviewing nursing home patients that were being brought in because they needed a plaster cast change on their wrist, to seeing a newborn baby who potentially has a developmental dysplasia with their hip, and they need to check them and put a harness on to manage them, to then going back and doing a mobility assessment on a patient who's been admitted to the ward after having a syncopal event and needing mobility assessment to work out whether they're going to be suitable or not to go home. And the range of presentations you can see across a day, let alone across a week, is so diverse that you never really have that same consistency as if you work in the same specialty for a period of time. It really needs the ability to know a little about a lot, and that has limitations in how much you can learn and how much you can deal with providing the best evidence-based care for every presentation that walks in. And if you're a sole practitioner, which is a case for a lot of allied health clinicians in rural areas, you don't have the same level of professional support as what's available to you as if you were working in a larger hospital. The ability to just ask a senior or to ask another colleague in terms of what would you do in this scenario, or how would you go about doing this, or any advice you can impart, can quite often be a 2-day phone tag process while you're trying to get a hold of the person who you want to ask a question of, and then while they're trying to get back to you. Or similarly, you could be waiting days for an email response to it. It can be very, very difficult to get that professional supervision and support that comes as second nature of being in a larger facility. Allied health professionals are particularly identified as being in a particular significant shortfall. My own profession, physiotherapy, is a little bit more fortunate that we tend to have more than other allied health professions in rural fields, but we're still significantly limited in terms of the number of clinicians we have in rural areas. Nurses in particular, they're also significantly constrained in the number that are available, but not only the number of hours they need to work as well. If there's a shortage of nursing staff available and you're the only nurse that's available and they need someone to cover your shift and or stay back to cover the next shift, then there really isn't many other options associated with that, unfortunately. Similarly, there's 80% less medical specialists in remote areas compared to what there are in major cities. And again, that's a deal, a result of there being issues around the number of people that are suitable for a specialist to be managing in a particular rural area compared to in a metropolitan area, but also the willingness of them to move and to make the investment that quite often goes with setting up a medical specialty practice in such a large area when you may not have the ability to have everybody travel to you, and you may need to set up multiple clinics across multiple towns for you to travel as well. It impacts the ability for medical specialists to be able to effectively set themselves up in an area as well. And again, all these can build on top of each other. And if you don't have a medical specialist in a particular area, that means that you're not going to have regular access to those types of presentations being managed, which means the nursing staff and the allied health staff then don't get the same level of exposure to those regular presentations as if there was a medical specialist there. And again, it leads to this more of a generalist type nature that goes into being an actual rural health clinician. So what are some of the things you can do to help overcome that? Well, fortunately, the tyranny of distance can very much be broken down these days by the use of telehealth. And telehealth can take on many different forms and is described in many different ways, from being simply an app on a phone to being an encrypted connection using phone and audio. But telehealth really refers to the delivery of services by healthcare organisations using a platform where clinicians and patients are not in the same location. Quite often when people think telehealth, they think something like Skype, but in reality, privacy regulations and data protection laws mean you need to have an encrypted form of connection. And while Skype is commonplace, it's to use in the general public, it's not something that can be used in a healthcare environment, but there's plenty of other applications out there that meet the legislative requirements for data encryption and for privacy regulations. And telehealth is essentially using a webcam or using a phone to be able to connect a clinician and a patient that may or may not be in the same location. And most people may not even realise that now telehealth is a Medicare billable event. And if you need to receive specialist care and you need to have a medical officer present at the other end, then both the GP and the medical specialist can be billed under Medicare for there to be financial reimbursement for both parties to be involved in consultation. The advent of technology over the last 10 to 15 years has really accelerated the ability for telehealth to make a difference in terms of bridging the rural healthcare divide. The advent of smartphones, particularly, has made it a lot easier for people to be able to utilise telehealth on their end. The IT issues that may go with using a computer, installing a webcam and setting everything up on a computer is overcome when people are much more intuitively used to using smartphones. You can simply download an app and punch some details in and away they go. But also access to the national broadband network and the theoretical, at least faster connection speeds that go with the rollout of that network decreases what's known as the latency in the connection, which basically means the lag between what you saying or seeing something and it actually happening, meaning that connections start to happen in real time, and it makes it much more feasible to be having a consultation via that method as opposed to having constant issues with dropouts or delays in messages being received and sent. That, and there's a growing willingness of people to use telehealth. as an option, as awareness grows around the ability of it to prevent the need to be able to travel 4, 6, 8 hours return trip. It makes life a lot easier for people to use it. Changes in Medicare have also resulted in billable rights for medical practitioners to provide telehealth, which has been a significant financial incentive as well. As I mentioned, if you need to have a medical officer present at each end, that can be billed at both ends by both a GP and the specialist. And similarly, if you have an allied health clinician at one end and a specialist at one end, that's still a Medicare billable event for the specialist at least. Unfortunately, it's not the other way around. If you're an allied health clinician and you're doing a telehealth presentation, telehealth consultation rather, and you have a GP on the other end, they can't actually claim that as a Medicare billable event. So there's a few barriers still to allied health utilising telehealth for consultations, but from a medical specialty point of view, it's been a significant bugbear that it wasn't billable. And now that it is through the Medicare benefit schemes, it's resulted in a significant increase in the amount of consultations and GPs and specialists willing to use telehealth to manage rural patients. So to give a bit of a comparison in terms of the benefits, there's other countries in the world that do face similar issues to what we do in terms of rural location and the impact that it has. Canada in particular is an area that is renowned for huge, vast, open rural areas with sparse population densities. And Canada is probably about 10 to 15 years ahead of Australia in terms of the rollout of telehealth and its utilisation within their healthcare system. And when I was looking for opportunities to improve the model of care for people with spinal fractures in rural areas that I was involved with caring for, Canada kept coming up as a great example of some of the systems they have in place and some of the benefits that were developed as a result of telehealth. So this is a report from 2011 in regards to Canada and some of the benefits associated with telehealth in Canada. The report over the timeline that it was done, which I think was 12 months off the top of my head, identified there was 47 million kilometres of travel saved for patients as a result of telehealth in Canada. And that equated to 5.6 million litres of fuel saved. There was a reduction in wait time for crisis services in rural communities from 48 hours to 2 hours. That was specifically in regards to mental health crisis services and the ability for mental health nurses in particular to be able to provide crisis interventions rather than having to take days to travel to the patient or the patient travel to them. They could utilise telehealth and have a response time down to within several hours. Wound nurse reviews dropped from 3 weeks to 2 to 3 days for their ability to perform reviews for people in their own home settings, again by eliminating the need for both parties to travel, and identified there was over $55 million in health system savings through reduced travel subsidies, which Australia also has as well. In New South Wales, it's called IPTAS. I'm not sure what itinerations it takes in other states, but it's a subsidy payment to patients who travel for medical treatment over a certain distance, and if you can eliminate the need for transport for travel and transport, then you eliminate the need to pay that subsidy to patients. It also resulted in reduced inpatient healthcare costs as well. To give you an appreciation of how sparsely populated some of the areas are and some of the provinces are in Canada, you can have a look there in terms of population density by square kilometres. Some of the much larger and sparse provinces of Canada, Yukon, Nunavut, the Northwest Territories, Newfoundland and Labrador, you can all see there have extremely low population densities, or there may not even be a person in particular areas, which gives us the value of 0. And 21% of Canadians live in a rural area. Comparing that to Australia, for example, surprisingly, we still have areas that have hugely sparse populations as well. We have a highly urbanised area around our east coast, and you can see the population densities for the areas like Greater Sydney, Greater Melbourne and Greater Adelaide are significant, but once you start to move into the more regional areas, you can see particularly how sparse it becomes. New South Wales overall has a population density of 9.5, but if you move into regional areas, that drops to 3. Victoria has a population density of 26, but drops to 7 in regional areas. And again, looking at South Australia, it drops to 0 very quickly. And 29% of Australians live in rural areas. Interestingly, the reason why Greater Sydney is 400, whereas Greater Melbourne is 9,800, the geographical area that's used to calculate these by Australian Bureau of Statistics in Sydney includes several large national parks. which impacts on that population density, and they actually provide that as an appendix in their report to say this isn't a typo error. So that's why there is such a significant discrepancy between Melbourne and Sydney. If you remove those national park areas, then the numbers become much closer to that of the Greater Melbourne area. But as you can see, the population densities aren't that too different to what's faced by the Canadian healthcare system. So using them as a sort of a yardstick to identify potential for telehealth is quite a reasonable one. So some of the benefits that you will get from utilising telehealth is you don't need to travel, whether that be clinicians travelling to outreach clinics or whether that be patients travelling in to see a health professional. Both parties, as long as they've got a stable internet connection, can stay in their home or at their place of regular work. You save hours and thousands of dollars through eliminating travel and healthcare costs. If you're not having to pay clinicians a day to travel to and from an outreach clinic, if you're not having to subsidise patients' travel if you're not having to provide inter-hospital transfers via emergency ambulance transfers, be that by road, be that by air, when you factor in how much movement occurs in the healthcare system every day, for patients moving between hospitals or travelling to and from clinics, it doesn't take long for those cost savings, which may not be large for each individual case, but they quickly compound. And another benefit that comes out of telehealth as well is that if you've got a GP that's consistently telehealthing to the same specialist, or you've got an allied health professional that's constantly telehealthing with the same medical specialist, it provides a networking opportunity between those clinicians, and all of a sudden that name on a referral, that name on a consultation letter starts to have a face to it, and you start to build a professional relationship, and you start to get an appreciation of what that professional does or doesn't do with certain presentations, which can go a long way to helping improve the care for patients as well. If there's a stronger professional relationship between health professionals, and it also has benefits as well in terms of overcoming any issues that might occur as a result of still having not having a face-to-face consultation. Some examples of telehealth models of care that exist that I'm aware of and have some involvement with in New South Wales. There is the Neonatal and Emergency Transport Service, which is also the paediatric transport service in New South Wales. It's heavily relied on using telehealth as a first point of contact, being able to identify critically unwell neonates and children who need escalations of care to a paediatric hospital or a paediatric intensive care unit. In where I operate in the Hunter New England region, there's also a critical care telehealth service for adults as well. Every emergency department and intensive care unit in Hunter New England Local Health District has a telehealth connection to it, and there is a designated consultant intensive care specialist or emergency department physician in the John Hunter Hospital who's able to provide telehealth consultations to patients and to staff in rural hospitals so that they receive timely oversight and advice in terms of what to do for emergency presentations or for deteriorating patients. Similarly as well, John Hunter Hospital also offers a telethrombolysis service for acute stroke management. So for patients who can't make it to the John Hunter Hospital within a timeline that have got an acute stroke and may be amenable to being thrombolyzed, they can go to one of the satellite hospitals within the Northern New South Wales region and utilise the telehealth network that's been established as a part of the critical care service, actually, to then have a neurologist be able to consult and provide advice in terms of the suitability for a patient to be thrombolyzed as a result of their stroke and provide information around and assistance in the provision of that. And there's also been an advent of telehealth fracture clinics throughout Northern New South Wales as well. Again, where orthopaedics is quite a common speciality to see out in rural areas when it's still a 2 to 4 hour drive to get to the fracture clinic. The ability for people to travel to have a cast change or to get an x-ray done and to see the specialist is impaired, and there's been quite a growth in that area, and particularly, which I'll show you shortly, around using allied health professionals as a way to perform telehealth fracture clinics, and it's been quite successful as well. So for allied health, as I've mentioned, there are some barriers to utilising telehealth. Unfortunately, the Medicare benefits scheme doesn't facilitate payment to allied health professionals for using telehealth. But that's not to say that there still isn't benefits to that. If there is a GP or there is a specialist on one end of telehealth connection and they're providing the consultation, then they can still receive a Medicare benefit payment as a result of the telehealth professional. Unfortunately, it's just the allied health person on the other end that can't. And that's seen the development of multiple telehealth fracture clinic models in northern New South Wales that have been multiple award winnings. Armidale Hospital runs a telehealth fracture clinic for multiple outlying hospitals that is very much physiotherapy led. There is a orthopaedic surgeon and an orthopaedic registrar that are involved in the clinic in Armidale, and they provide consultation to patients that are out in outlying facilities that may be several hours drive away. And Inverell is one of the centres that is involved with the Armidale Telehealth Clinic, and it's had huge success in reducing the need for people to travel 90 minutes down the highway to have a consultation in the fracture clinic. And it's resulted in a lot of patient satisfaction, hours saved in transport, and improving healthcare outcomes. Because quite often, if this clinic wasn't available, then people would often be getting managed by their GP rather than travelling to a specialist clinic appointment, which the benefits of having the telehealth model is it allows people to at least be overseen and consult with a specialist still, but it also means that GPs aren't overloaded with additional patients that they may or may not be comfortable being able to manage, and has overall benefits for everyone involved. To give you an appreciation of some of the healthcare costs that go into moving people around in the hospital system, these rates are based on the 2019 New South Wales health rates. To give you an appreciation of what the costs are of road versus air ambulance. So an inter-hospital transfer by road is charged at a rate of $1.87 per kilometre. If it's a non-emergency, there's also a call-out fee associated with that. If it's an emergency, then the rate increases to $6.59 per kilometre. And that just basically the difference is if it's a non-emergency, quite often will go with a patient transport service that doesn't require specialist paramedics or nursing staff. Whereas if it is an emergency, then you'll have higher acuity patients, and you'll have higher trained health professionals involved. It goes to a maximum of $6,183 is where it caps out at, but that's one way. So if you transport a patient to a facility to escalate the care and you need to transfer them back to facilitate getting them closer to home or for ongoing care, then potentially that cost can double. To give you an appreciation, helicopter cost, that is charged on a minute basis. So you can see from there, it's a flat fee of $6,991 for the first 30 minutes in helicopter, but it's then charged with 6-minute blocks after that. And most helicopter transfers around Hunter, New England region quite often are an hour to 90-minute type range to get between all the major hospitals in northern New South Wales, and then that's a reasonable time frame. And you can see that quickly escalates into quite expensive costs associated with transfers. To give you an appreciation of what a bed costs in a Hunter, New England facility, based on the Medicare ineligible rate, so that's basically people who are eligible for Medicare, namely overseas residents, they get charged a full fee associated with a hospital stay, and if you're in a critical care bed, that's $3,437 per day, and it's $1,383 for a non-critical care bed, which again, if you multiply by several days and by several hundred patients, it quickly balloons into significant healthcare costs. So from here, I'm going to be talking now about a specific model of care looking at neurosurgical patients, and namely spinal fractures that I was involved with. You can find this information on the Australian Journal of Rural Health, and it was published in March last year. I'd like to thank all my co-authors that were involved in developing this model of care, but also in writing this presentation, writing up this paper rather, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. And if you'd like further information or some more nuts and bolts beyond what I provide here, you can have a look at this, the full journal article to get a bit more of appreciation. So to give you a bit of background on the equipment that we use, Össur is the main provider of our spinal bracing equipment in the area that I work and the health district that I work in. We use for our cervical collars, Miami Jane Philadelphia collars, but we also, for our TLSO stock, we've just started using the Miami lumbar, the Miami TLSO 464. We were using the Miami lumbar prior to this, and we've been using it for multiple years. And it was actually the implementation and starting to use the Miami lumbar was the reason for why we developed this model of care. We essentially worked out that if we're going to be training ourselves up to utilize a particular brace, why not take everyone else who's involved in the care along with the process? And that quickly developed into developing a model of care and a training package that went out to rural areas as well. Some of the indications for the Miami TLSO is for conditions requiring gross immobilization up to the level of T7, spinal stenosis, herniated discs, degenerative spinal fractures, spondylolisthesis, and spondyliosis. There's a couple of different configurations that are available through the Miami TLSO 464. I personally am only still getting used to using these braces as we've only started using these, but I've found from the few that I have fitted in the last couple of weeks them to be a significant time saving over the Miami lumbar TLSO. The simple ability to measure and fit and apply really makes a difference in when you're time constrained, but also in terms of helping minimise anxiety and patients' pain while fitting them, because it's such a quick, faster process. And if you haven't checked them out, I really do recommend it because they are great little devices. So I'm not really going to touch too much on this, but just a brief overview in terms of the evidence behind TLSOs, no TLSOs. We use them historically to help aid in the management of conservative fractures in the area that I operate, and that's been long-standing practice for a long period of time. It's quite controversial in terms of whether there is any benefit gained from using TLSOs or not. There's now been quite a number of randomized control trials that have shown significant long-term follow-up in terms of 12 months and 3-5-year follow-ups that have shown that there really is no outcome in terms of the benefit of using a TLSO versus not to manage a stable burst fracture. But the one thing it did that is fairly consistent is the benefit is from in terms of managing patients' anxiety or patients' fears or in patients' pain. And that there is still quite strong evidence to support the use of a brace, and particularly TLSO, to manage a thoracolumbar fracture. But there is also a growing body of evidence that you can manage patients without them if you feel that there's not a significant benefit to be gained in using TLSOs. But we currently still use them in the John Hunter Hospital, as when we're dealing with patients who are travelling multiple hours or maybe a long way from assistance without telehealth, quite often having a brace available to provide that extra bit of support or that extra bit of comfort can be the difference between a patient managing with their injury versus not when they're discharged from hospital. But overall, all the evidence shows pretty clearly that a TLSO won't decrease the risk of kyphosis. It won't completely immobilise the fracture. And if you're thinking that that's why you need to apply it, then it really won't work. But it will help with patients' subjective symptoms. It will decrease the fear of movement, and it will decrease the risk of potentially going to surgery. And you can find the references that support that in the references section at the back. There's a couple of really good randomized control trials that have come out since probably 2014 that provide really clear guidance. So to give you some background on where I have applied my trade for the last couple of years, and to give you an appreciation of the healthcare environment which it operates in, the John Hunter Hospital is the only neurosurgical centre between Sydney and Queensland. It has a catchment area that covers multiple local health districts, and it is the only John Hunter is a major trauma centre as for both paediatrics and children. So we consult and are quite often required to consult on patients across the full age range. Patients historically have bypassed regional facilities if they've suffered a significant trauma or if they're needing a neurosurgical consult for fear of a spinal injury, and come directly to the John Hunter Hospital. About 10 to 15 years, all of our radiology systems became electronic and were linked. So it didn't matter if you had your CT scan, you had your X-ray imaging, or even if you had access to MRI. Places like Tamworth, Port Macquarie, Coffs Harbour, Armidale, those images could be viewed locally at the John Hunter Hospital without the patient necessarily needing to come down to be physically reviewed. If it was still warranted that a face-to-face medical consultation was required, that would still occur, but quite often the consultation could occur by phone. Imaging could be ordered and a management plan could be put in place based on the clinical assessment of patients at the local facility by the local medical officers, and then the neurosurgeons providing advice based on the assessment findings that they were informed of. The problem that we quite often found, though, was that nursing staff and allied health staff weren't in a position to be able to then facilitate managing those patients locally because they either didn't have access to the relevant spinal equipment, such as a TLSO or a Marnie J, because they didn't stock it, or they didn't have anyone who was competent to fit it, or the people that had fitted it had been so long since they fitted it that they didn't really feel it appropriate to be having a go at fitting it. And ultimately, patients were then being transferred down to the John Hunter to be managed. And quite often they were coming down to have a brace fitted, have their pain sorted, and then being sent back to their local facility for discharge planning and to sort out any services or any plans that may be required to facilitate getting them home. So seeing that this was becoming an increasing presentation, and we were seeing multiple patients throughout the year that were coming down really just to have a TLSO fitted, when if there was a ability to fit them locally and ability to support staff in a rural area that they come from to be able to fit and manage a patient in TLSO, it could go a long way to eliminating the need for transport and also an increased length of stay associated with that transport. We aim to engage with a multidisciplinary team of clinicians, so we involve medical staff, nursing staff, physiotherapy staff, occupational therapy staff across multiple sites in the New England region, with the aim to facilitate a new model of care utilising telehealth as its base to be able to connect patients and clinicians who had suffered a spinal fracture and had been deemed appropriate for conservative management, so they didn't need to travel to have a management plan developed and put into place. And it centered around using the telehealth as an ability to connect and put clinicians in contact with appropriate clinicians, be that nursing, be that medical, be that allied health. And that was accompanied by an upskilling and rural education roadshow that we did involving face-to-face education seminars and sessions across the New England region. And it aimed to increase the knowledge, confidence, and skills for patients to be managed at a local facility by staff working in those hospitals. To give you an appreciation of some of the distances that are faced from where I'm based to the areas where quite often patients were coming from, to get to Coffs Harbour is a 385 kilometre journey one way, Tamworth 277 kilometres, Armidale is 384 kilometres, and Moree, which is up near the Queensland border but still routinely refers patients down to the John Hunter Hospital as it still falls within the catchment area, is nearly 500 kilometres one way. And it was not uncommon to have patients, not so much from Moree, but particularly from Coffs Harbour, Tamworth, Armidale and Port Macquarie, as these are the large rural referral hospitals or base hospitals in their area, then being referred on to the John Hunter for consideration and management of their spinal fractures. To give you an example of one case that particularly caught our interest and we really thought we need to do something about this, it was a 28-year-old male who was involved in a motorbike accident while racing motocross. He lived about 2 hours from the John Hunter Hospital, and he was transferred to the John Hunter Hospital after his motorbike injury. Because of the mechanism of his injury, it triggered what was known as a trauma call, which is basically it requires the patient to come to a trauma centre. So it was appropriate for him to come to the John Hunter for his initial management and for his initial medical workup. He was identified as having a L2 fracture that was suitable to be managed in a TLSO, and he was discharged after 2 days, and it was an uneventful admission. The one key component was that it was medical orders from the managing neurosurgeon that his TLSO had to be fitted in lying. And that caused issues 2 days later when we received the phone call that this gentleman was back home, his brace had broken, and they needed advice on what to do. It had all fallen apart, and given that he was supposed to be lying down, the family weren't sure what to do. He, after speaking to us and at the hospital, basically became clear that he needed someone to have a look at his brace and to sort out what was going on. So the family and the patient made the decision to call an ambulance. The ambulance arrived and took him to the local hospital, which was only 5 minutes away for the ambulance, but they were the only ambulance in town, and they couldn't transport a patient from the town he was in to where he needed to be, at the John Hunter Hospital. They didn't have the capacity to do that. They would leave the entire town without an ambulance. And there was no one at the local hospital or the nearest rural referral hospital who had the skills or had the equipment to be able to manage to sort out the brace for the patient. After spending 6 hours in the local hospital, and there was 2 phone calls basically seeking advice on what to do, the patient was told that there's no way he was going to be coming to the John Hunter Hospital until after hours. It was most likely going to be an 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock type transfer, which meant that they'd be coming after hours, having to be admitted to hospital, all because their brace fell apart. The patient family decided to discharge themselves from the local hospital. They strapped everything together with a bit of masking tape, and they used a crepe bandage from memory, and they drove themselves down against advice to the John Hunter Hospital to get everything sorted out. And when they got here, it was a 20-minute process in an outpatient environment before we were able to fix everything up for him. And quite literally, all that happened was one of the posterior thoracic extensions that was utilised to hold the brace together had snapped, and it was causing the whole thoracic upgrade to float around, and it simply required that to be replaced, and the issue was fixed. But something that cost 20 cents was causing such significant angst and concern for the family, for the patient, and for clinicians in the local area that we really started to realise there needs to be a better system to be able to help manage these types of presentations. So we went about as a project team setting up a multi-phase process in order to develop a new model of care that used telehealth. At the time, back in 2013, when we first started, Wi-Fi connections had just started to be set up and were being routinely used in all the hospitals within northern New South Wales, so it meant that we could use a portable telehealth link. So it didn't matter if the patient was in the emergency department and admitted onto a ward or an outpatient setting, as long as we could get a laptop with a webcam, we could get a telehealth connection to the patient, and if we get a telehealth connection to the patient, all we needed to then do was identify clinicians who would be able to facilitate turning on the telehealth connection and doing whatever required intervention was needed at the local site. We first collaborated as a pilot with Tamworth Hospital as the first starting page. We set up a telehealth link and developed a series of processes and put policies and procedures and training in place with clinicians at Tamworth Hospital to facilitate setting up the model of care. It was highly successful and well received all around by both the Tamworth Hospital and also the John Hunter Hospital, and we were fortunate enough to then be able to roll the program out across all the northern New South Wales. And using the learning that we had received in the pilot phase in terms of our education package and when the telehealth connection would be beneficial versus when it wasn't, we were then able to scale and deploy the model of care to about 6 different hospitals across all of northern New South Wales. And finally, in 2016, we then looked to target some of the smaller hospitals in our area that weren't necessarily going to be fitting these braces from day to day, but were in such an isolated location that even if one or two showed up across the year, having staff who were able to utilise the telehealth link and seek assistance would go a long way to improving patient outcomes. So this flow diagram here gives you a bit of an appreciation of what we were facing in terms of prior to implementing the telehealth model of care, in terms of the delays that patients were quite often being involved. The typical process was a patient would present with a spinal injury, and I should make it clear when we're talking spinal injuries, I'm not talking about a neurological associated spinal injury. We're talking about people that have no neurological signs suitable for conservative management and have been deemed appropriate by a medical professional, namely the neurosurgeon, to be managed conservatively. But quite often what was happening was that a plan would be put in place from the neurosurgeon with the local medical officers, quite often in the emergency department, that they were suitable for a conservative management plan and it was suitable to be managed in a TLSO. But then issues were identified that there was no one at the site who could fit a TLSO, there was no TLSOs available, and there were no nursing staff who could care for someone in a TLSO. That resulted in the patient then needing to be transferred to the John Hunter Hospital. Because John Hunter Hospital is such a large hospital, quite often there was a delay of 1 to 2 days arranging transport and waiting for bed availability. They'd come to the John Hunter Hospital, they'd have a TLSO fitted, they would then have to wait to be transferred back to the local facility, and the local facility would then facilitate discharge planning and getting the patient home. And that would result in delays of between 1 and 3 days in terms of length of stay for the patient, and that would quite often be associated with aeromedical transport costs or road transport costs in a facility of $3,000 each way. So we identified that essentially all those areas highlighted in yellow could be eliminated if we utilised telehealth. This is what the model of care looked like that we see and we eventually did implement across northern New South Wales for people requiring a TLSO. You can see it's a much more streamlined process, and it also outlines quite clearly what the inclusion criteria we're dealing with. We weren't talking about large motor vehicle accidents with polytraumas needing multiple medical inputs. We're quite often talking about isolated spinal fractures as a result of quite often still trauma, but nowhere near a significant nature that required multiple medical inputs or required transfer to a trauma centre. And there was no reason why they couldn't be managed locally by local medical staff. If there was an appropriate allied health and nursing support in place to facilitate fitting a TLSO and manage the patient in the TLSO at that local facility. And if there was any other specialty input that was required, then they weren't to be prevented from travelling to the John Hunter just because the TLSO could be fitted locally. So some of the outcomes that we started to see when we analysed the data retrospectively, looking back in a period of, I think it was 6 months, we were able to show that there was 21 patients that were transferred to the John Hunter that could be managed under a telehealth model of care. When we started looking at data prospectively, we started to support those numbers and show that there were multiple patients that were being admitted to the John Hunter for the purpose of having a TLSO fitted. In the space of 6 months, we found 10 patients that ended up accounting for 25 bed days at the John Hunter, had a TLSO fitted and were needed to be transported each way. And it was adding costs anywhere between $4,000 and $6,000 in terms of healthcare costs that potentially could be avoided through transport and bed days per patient. And as I said, once you started accumulating that across multiple patients, it became quite clear that there was potential savings of a significant level for both the healthcare system, but also for patients and their families. Because if a patient's travelling down and they've got a family member that has to come with them, that family member needs to be able to find a way to get down, be it either by car or by public transport. And if their family member's been admitted to hospital, they need to pay for accommodation. So there was financial implications not only for the health service, but also for patients as well. Across the 3 years that it took us to implement the project, across northern New South Wales, we were able to capture 81 patients under the model of care. We were able to show that the mean length of stay for that cohort was 9 days prior to us utilising a telehealth model of care, and it reduced to 4 days as a result of people that were then managed under the new telehealth model of care. That resulted in 405 bed days being eliminated across those 81 patients, 162 in hospital transfers, and nearly 24,500 kilometres of eliminated travel in hospital transfers. When you converted that into healthcare costs in terms of bed days and the cost of transfers, these numbers are based on 2016 numbers, which is slightly different to the one I presented earlier, which is 2019 data. But we're able to show that it was around $1.2 million in efficiency savings for people that just needed to have a TLSO fitted for their spinal injury. And there was then, based on the groundwork we had done, there was then potential to use this in other neurosurgical settings as well, whether that be for management of cervical collars, which was not as common, or for other presentations outside the scope of spinal management. It showed that there was great potential to be able to use a telehealth model of care to help overcome the issues around staff confidence, staff ability to manage what are considered to be specialty presentations, but also to improve patient outcomes significantly as well. To give you a breakdown by some of the hospitals and the costs that were associated with each one of those, and a breakdown of where the patients came from, you can see there the majority of the patients we dealt with came from the New England region in terms of from Tamworth, and also from the North Coast in terms of Taree, and there were a few patients that we captured from Moree, which, as I touched on earlier, is only 1,000 kilometre return journey. Interestingly, there was also a large number of people that came from Belmont, which is only a smaller hospital that's still located within the Newcastle area, but still had fairly significant cost savings associated with managing patients locally at those facilities, because even though it was nearby, staff still didn't feel confident to be able to manage patients appropriately. So we were able to provide an opportunity for them to be able to be upskilled and trained in how to manage and how to care for a TLSO and how to operate a telehealth connection, essentially. To give an appreciation of how staff felt before and after we had implemented the model of care and provided an education package. We surveyed staff before and after. We'd provided them with an education package and done a in-service day at each of the sites we were rolling out to. And there were statistically significant improvements in the overall scores of people's knowledge around managing spinal fractures and TLSOs. So the education package was a face-to-face education day that would involve lectures and hands-on practical fitting of braces, the theory underlining how spinal injuries occur, how they're classified, how they're managed, some of the personal care considerations, some of the restrictions that go into managing them all, but also on telehealth and the IT side of how to use the connection, how to connect it, and where the benefits for it were. And overall, as you can see, there was a significant improvement in terms of the knowledge and skills that clinicians had and willingness to be able to manage those type of injuries. Post-implementation is an example of some of the benefits that we saw. So a patient who sustained a T7 fracture after falling downstairs in a rural hospital about 220 kilometres from the John Hunter was consulted by the neurosurgeon was on call at the time by the local GP in the emergency department. Because that patient was able to have their scans done locally in the local facility and could be viewed online via our electronic radiology system, it was deemed appropriate that there was a TLSO would be the most appropriate management option for that patient. The slight issue that was faced that this was still a site that was quite small and hadn't been trained up in fitting patients with TLSOs and didn't have the telehealth process in place. But they were only a much shorter distance away from one of the nearby rural hospitals. And after liaising between the local physiotherapist, the local medical officer, the consultant neurosurgeon and the John Hunter team and the rural referral centre, we were able to facilitate the patient to be transferred closer to the rural referral centre that was closer to them and have them managed there, which resulted in a one-day admission as opposed to at a 130 kilometre round journey as opposed to nearly what would have been a 500 kilometre round journey and most likely would have been a significantly longer timeline had they needed to come down to the John Hunter Hospital. And they were discharged home 6 weeks. They were discharged home and were followed up as an outpatient 6 weeks. And it was a really good networking example in terms of how the model of care could work, because even though this patient presented to a site that hadn't been targeted in the second phase of the rollout, they were close enough to one and to a rural referral centre that had been targeted in the second phase of the rollout, and they were more than willing to assist and help because they could see the benefits that could come from facilitating that patient being managed at their facility instead of having to come down to the John Hunter Hospital. So overall, hopefully that'll give you a bit of an appreciation of some of the benefits that can come from telehealth, some of the benefits that can come from the professional networking that are available as a result of utilising telehealth, and how it can be beneficial as a strategy to help support patients to remain in their local communities. Admittedly, if you're dealing with spinal injuries, spinal fractures, and spinal orthotics on a day-to-day basis, it all becomes quite routine and you feel quite confident and capable of managing it. But if you're working in an area where you're a sole practitioner, your nearest support service is a couple of 100 kilometres away, and this is the first time you've even seen a patient with a spinal fracture, let alone heard of a TLSO, it can all be quite daunting and quite scary. And having a process in place to be able to support and to be able to provide assistance to clinicians that are placed in that situation can go a long way to helping overcome some of the fears and concerns, both for patients and clinicians, around managing these types of presentations. And if you can help to break down those barriers, you significantly improve the outcomes for patients and also for the clinicians that are managing them as well. So I have no doubt that there will be plenty of opportunities for telehealth to be further embedded into healthcare, whether that be in relation to neurosurgery, whether that be in relation to orthopedics or in allied health practice in general. They're moving forward into the future. I think we're only going to see more and more opportunities for telehealth to be embedded into healthcare and to be embedded into models of care to help break down the tyranny of distance and help overcome the rural metropolitan healthcare divide that is still significant across Australia. So with that in mind, if you would like to have a look at any of the references, I'll just flick through them so you can see them there. From here, I'll hand over and basically see if there's anybody who's got any questions they'd like to throw to me. Some of those. So when you're ready, by all means, fire away.